Hey folks, B59 here. Welcome back to Piasa Transport. And today we're going to try something new. One of the things I love about Transport Fever is the sense of immersion and the opportunity for world building and storytelling that it presents. And we're going to explore that a bit today. And we're going to first introduce you to Eliza Beitel. And she is right here on the dock, waiting for the boat to Cape Girardeau. She is the Chief Operating Officer of Piasa Transport. And she has been charged with hopping on the boats, going all the way down to New Orleans, and to meet with each of the line managers, the branch managers for each of the ports, get their records, review the operations, and make recommendations to Piasa Transport that will help them run better lines and make more money. It just so happens that also on this same journey is a gentleman by the name of Samuel Clemens, who we may also know as Mark Twain. And so they haven't met yet, but I think there could be some opportunity here for a little bit of storytelling and a little bit of discussion between Eliza and Mr. Clemens as well. Eliza is quite a successful woman. She grew up in a little river town on the Illinois River called Calhoun, not far from Alton, and she got a job at Piasa Transport as a bookkeeper. Her talent was recognized. She was promoted quickly. She became a finance manager, and then ultimately a branch manager for the St. Louis lines. And then was so successful in that role that she became the Chief Operating Officer of Piasa Transport. And so what she says happens. And so she's going to be making recommendations, and those recommendations are going to be carried out. And as we see that Chicago boat coming in behind us, I think the first thing she's going to probably say and recommend is that our boats are in terrible shape and they need to be upgraded. And as she waits for the Cape Girardeau boat to pick her up, she looks at it and says the same thing. So that's going to be the first thing on her findings and recommendation list. Let's increase the maintenance on our steamboats on the Cape Girardeau line and on the Chicago line. So we'll watch them board here. And we've got Mr. Clemens and we have Ms. Beitel. And we're going to enjoy this little journey. Now, while she was in St. Louis, the branch manager there gave her all the records relating to the Missouri River lines and to the St. Louis operations. And so, as she kicks off here, she's going to start by taking a look at those static reports. And so we're going to look at those with her now. And really, the first thing she noticed, and if we go over here, we'll see this here is the headquarters of Piasa Transport, located here in Alton on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. What she noticed coming over here, first of all, is that this bridge is really not the best bridge. It's not in bad shape, but it has a hump, and it's really slowing down traffic that's trying to get across the river, and so it could probably be replaced. And in fact, Piasa Transport remains grateful to the city of St. Louis for the funding it provided initially to help build out the St. Louis harbor and make Piasa Transport, give it the opportunities it's had to become such a great and successful transport company. And so she's going to recommend that Piasa Transport build this bridge for the city of St. Louis. She also noticed, however, that the trams here in St. Louis are really old and in bad shape. And not only are they in bad shape, but they're also outdated. They're last generation trams, and they really need to get the newest trams on this line. A little more capacity, a little more speed. All of these things are good things. So she's going to add that to her recommendation list as well. She also now is taking a look at the records relating to the St. Louis Machines Factory. The Machines Factory here supplies machines to St. Louis and to Alton. But when we look at the factory, it's only shipping it's only producing 108 machines. St. Louis requires 165 machines, and Alton requires another 70 machines. So something is wrong here. We're not getting enough production, and she thinks it's probably due to steel, that we're just not getting enough steel into this machines factory. However, that's not something we're going to solve immediately because she doesn't see a nearby solution to this problem. So we're going to park that one in a problems to solve list. And as she goes down the river and she meets with all the branch managers and she takes a look at the records of all the different lines and the industries, she's going to hopefully get some ideas on how we can solve this problem, along with others that end up on the problems to solve list. So having taken a look here at St. Louis, she decides to take a look at the records relating to the passenger service up the Missouri River. So today, St. Louis has a passenger run that starts in St. Louis, goes to Columbia, Kansas City, and up to Omaha. And we can see, that it's having a little bit of trouble keeping up. We've got 156 people waiting here in Columbia to go to St. Louis. And we also have, quite a few people now, not up here so far at the moment because they just got picked up. But, or actually they're getting ready to be picked up. 45 in Omaha. And quite a few there as well. But mostly here in Columbia Halt and then down in St. Louis. Looking at these records, what she's thinking, and she dives a little deeper too. She says, let's take a look at the destination requirements of these cities. So St. Louis is sending quite a few people to Columbia. It's sending quite a few people to Jefferson City. It's sending quite a few people to Kansas City. And even a few people to Topeka. But when it gets to Omaha, again, not very many people are going all the way to Omaha from St. Louis. Likewise, when we look at Omaha, the other end of the line, and the destinations there, she can see that there's a lot of passengers that want to go to Kansas City, 48 and 51. Fewer that want to go to Jefferson City, only 7 and 6. And more that want to go to Topeka, 29 and 29. So what Eliza's thinking is that this line could be made more efficient by creating a dedicated line between Omaha and Kansas City that will really serve the needs of this Tri-City area, but will also provide a way for Omaha citizens to get down to Kansas City. And if they are heading on to Jefferson City or Columbia or St. Louis, they can grab the boat in Kansas City and go down there. This will also enable her to shorten the line between St. Louis and Omaha, take Omaha out of the picture, and just run here between St. Louis, Jeff City, Columbia, and Kansas City. And I think that'll take care of some of the congestion that they're having on the docks here in the lower river. She also takes a look at the cargo records and sees a few areas that could have some improvement as well. One is, we can see right here that the brick line running from Jefferson City to Columbia is not able to keep up. This line has a rate of 77, but Columbia wants 91, and clearly we can supply that here in the construction plan in Jefferson City because the cargo station is full. So her recommendation is going to be to add some more trucks to this line so that we can fully supply Columbia and make more money. She also takes a look at this line, this barge line that's running from Jefferson City to St. Louis and carrying bricks. This line was originally established not because St. Louis here needs bricks, but because Cape Girardeau does, and because the boats that were running steel from Evansville to St. Louis were running back empty, and we wanted to give them something to do, so at least carry some bricks back from St. Louis to Cape Girardeau. But it's really not worth it, I don't think, or Eliza doesn't think, to go all this distance down to St. Louis to only be really bringing, a handful of bricks into Cape Girardeau. She also sees that Topeka needs bricks. So what she's going to do is she's going to recommend that this line be repurposed, and instead of going to St. Louis, it goes up to Topeka. And she's also going to keep in mind that that would enable her to bring back food from Topeka, and maybe there will be some places further down the line that need it. Alton, for instance, needs food, so maybe that would be an opportunity to get food into Alton. She also saw that Kansas City and Omaha both need tools and fuel as well, so that's something else she's getting on her problems to solve list. So those are all some great recommendations that she's making, and when she gets to Cape Girardeau, she's going to turn them over to the branch manager there. He'll post them up to back to headquarters, and headquarters will send out the instructions to St. Louis branch manager to implement these changes on the lines that are within his control. And we will see that in the next episode. In the meantime, we're going to rejoin Ms. Beitel on the boat with heading here out of St. Louis down towards Cape Girardeau. And when she gets done with her work, she decides to go up and visit her friend Horace, who's the pilot. And so she steps into the pilot house, and when she does, lo and behold, there's of course is Mr. Clemens talking to the pilot. And Mr. Clemens, he looks at Eliza and with a bit of shock on his face, because how dare this civilian come into the pilot house, this sacred hall of the pilot, and interfere. And he looks over at the pilot, and he's expecting a string of curses and for her to be chased out of the pilot house. But instead, the pilot greets her warmly and says, "Well, hello, Ms. Beitel. It's great to see you again. What brings you on this trip?" And so she tells him about her operations review. And the three of them start discussing life on the Mississippi. And she turns to Mr. Clemens and says, "Well, Samuel, can you tell me a little bit about what it was like when you started out as a cub pilot on the Mississippi River?" And so he launches into this explanation of what it was like on his first trip he took from New Orleans to St. Louis, and then they got back on the boat in St. Louis to head back down to New Orleans, and this is what he told her. "When I returned to the pilot house, St. Louis was gone and I was lost. Here was a piece of river which was all down in my book, but I could make neither head nor tail of it. You understand, it was turned around. I had seen it when coming upstream, but I had never faced about to see how it looked when it was behind me. My heart broke again, for it was plain that I had got to learn this troublesome river both ways. The pilot house was full of pilots, going down to look at the river. What is called the Upper River, the 200 miles between St. Louis and Cairo, where the Ohio comes in, was low, and the Mississippi changes its channels so constantly that the pilots used to always find it necessary to run down to Cairo to take a fresh look when their boats were to lie in port a week, that is, when the water was at a low stage. A deal of this looking at the river was done by four poor fellows who seldom had a berth, and its only hope of getting one lay in their being always freshly posted and therefore ready to drop into the shoes of some reputable pilot for a single trip on account of such pilot's sudden illness or some other necessity. And a good many of them constantly ran up and down inspecting the river, not because they ever really hoped to get a berth, but because, they being guests of the boat, it was cheaper to look at the river than stay ashore and pay board. In time, these fellows grew dainty in their tastes and only infested boats that had an established reputation for setting good tables. All visiting pilots were useful, for they were always ready and willing, winter or summer, night or day, to go out in the yawl and help buoy the channel or assist the boat's pilots in any way they could. They were likewise welcome because all pilots are tireless talkers when gathered together, and as they talk only about the river, they are always understood and are always interesting. Your true pilot cares nothing about anything on earth but the river, and his pride in his occupation surpasses the pride of kings. We had a fine company of these river inspectors along this trip. There were 8 or 10, and there was abundance of room for them in our great pilot house. 2 or 3 of them wore polished silk hats, elaborate shirt fronts, diamond breastpins, kid gloves, and patent leather boots. They were choice in their English and bore themselves with a dignity proper to men of solid means and prodigious reputation as pilots. The others were more or less loosely clad and wore upon their heads tall felt cones that were suggestive of the days of the Commonwealth. I was a cipher in this august company and felt subdued, not to say torpid. I was not even of sufficient consequence to assist at the wheel when it was necessary to put the tiller hard down in a hurry. The guest that stood nearest did that when occasion required, and this was pretty much all the time because of the crookedness of the channel and the scant water. I stood in a corner, and the talk I listened to took the hope all out of me. One visitor said to another, "Jim, how did you run Plum Point coming up?" It was in the night there, and I ran it the way one of the boys on the Diana told me. Started out about 50 yards above the wood pile on the false point, and held on the cabin under Plum Point till I raised the reef, quarter less twain, then straightened up for the middle bar till I got well abreast the old one-limbed cottonwood in the bend, then got my stern on the cottonwood and head on the low place above the point, and came through a booming 9.5. Pretty square crossing, ain't it? Yes, but the upper bar's working down fast. Another pilot spoke up and said, I had better water than that and ran it lower down. Started out from the false point, Mark Twain, raised the second reef abreast the big snag in the bend, and had quarter less twain. One of the gorgeous ones remarked, I don't want to find fault with your leadsman, but that's a good deal of water for Plum Point, it seems to me. There was an approving nod all around as this quiet snub dropped on the booster and settled him. And so they went on talking. Meantime, the thing that was running in my mind was, now if my ears hear aright, I have not only to get the names of all the towns and islands and bends and so on by heart, but I must even get up a warm personal acquaintanceship with every old snag and one-limbed cottonwood and obscure woodpile that ornaments the banks of this river for 1,200 miles. And more than that, I must actually know where these things are in the dark. Unless these guests are gifted with eyes that can pierce through 2 miles of solid blackness. I wish the piloting business was in Jericho and I had never thought of it. At dusk, Mr. Bixby tapped the big bell 3 times, the signal to land, and the captain emerged from his drawing room in the forward end of the Texas and looked up inquiringly. Mr. Bixby said, We will lay up here all night, Captain. Very well, sir. That was all. The boat came to shore and was tied up for the night. It seemed to me a fine thing that the pilot could do as he pleased without asking so grand a captain's permission. She asked him, so what is it like today? I mean, what do you see in terms of changes in St. Louis today? Samuel described how he took a tour of St. Louis with his friend, and he tells Eliza, the further we drove in our inspection tour, the more sensibly I realized how the city had grown since I had seen it last. Changes in detail became steadily more apparent and frequent than at first, too. Changes uniformly evidencing progress, energy, prosperity. But the change of changes was on the levee, this time a departure from the rule. Half a dozen sound-asleep steamboats where I used to see a solid mile of wide-awake ones. This was melancholy. This was woeful. The absence of the pervading and jocund steamboatman from the billiard saloon was explained. He was absent because he is no more. His occupation is gone. His power is passed away. He is absorbed into the common herd. He grinds at the mill, a shorn Samson and inconspicuous. Half a dozen lifeless steamboats, a mile of empty wharves, in a wide and soundless vacancy where the serried hosts of commerce used to contend. Here was desolation indeed. The old sea, as one in tears, comes murmuring with foamy lips and knocking at the vacant piers, calls for his long-lost multitude of ships. The towboat and the railroad had done their work and done it well and completely. The mighty bridge stretching along above our heads had done its share in the slaughter and spoliation. Remains of former steamboatmen told me with wan satisfaction that the bridge doesn't pay. Still, it can be no sufficient compensation to a corpse to know that the dynamite that laid him out was not of as good quality as it had been supposed to be. The pavements along the riverfront were bad. The sidewalks were rather out of repair. There was a rich abundance of mud. All this was familiar and satisfying. But the ancient armies of drays and struggling throngs of men and mountains of freight were gone, and Sabbath reigned in their stead. The immemorial mile of cheap foul doggeries remained, but business was dull with them. The multitudes of poison-swilling Irishmen had departed, and in their places were a few scattering handfuls of ragged people, some drinking, some drunk, some nodding, others asleep. St. Louis is a great and prosperous and advancing city, but the river edge of it seems dead past resurrection. Mississippi steamboating was born about 1812. At the end of 30 years, it had grown to mighty proportions, and in no less than 30 more, it was dead. A strangely short life for so majestic a creature. Of course, it is not absolutely dead. Neither is a crippled octogenarian who could once jump 22 feet on level ground. But as contrasted with what it was in its prime vigor, Mississippi steamboating may be called dead. It killed the old-fashioned keel boating by reducing the freight trip to New Orleans to less than a week. The railroads have killed the steamboat passenger traffic by doing in 2 or 3 days what the steamboats consumed a week in doing. And the towing fleets have killed the through freight traffic by dragging 6 or 7 steamer loads of stuff down the river at a time, on an expense so trivial that steamboat competition was out of the question. Freight and passenger way traffic remains to the steamers. As they waited at Cape Girardeau for passengers to unload and load and fuel to be brought on board, Eliza met with the branch manager in Cape Girardeau, and he turned over all of their records, and they talked a bit about how the operations were going, and he's responsible for the Ohio River, and so he gave her all the records for the lines up the Ohio River. And he also said, well, I have to say, Eliza, one of the challenges that we have here is that our cargo wharf here in Cape Girardeau just isn't up to the task. It's kind of butt ugly, if you'll pardon me, Miss Beitel. But, on top of that, it is at times experiencing boats lining up, trying to get into the harbor, and not being their most efficient because they're waiting in the river while another boat loads and unloads. So we'd appreciate it if you'd take a look at all of this and help us figure out what would be a better configuration for our harbor here. So they sat down together and went over the records and waited for the boat, passenger boat, to get ready to take off again. And we will pick them up on the next leg of their journey from Cape Girardeau to Memphis. But before we rejoin them, what we're going to do in the next episode is we're going to sit down and look at the recommendation list that Eliza provided to us, and we're going to implement those changes and improve Piasa Transport's prospects. So thank you all for joining for this episode. I hope that you found it interesting, and I will see you again next time.